joining us. We apologise for the technical difficulties at the beginning of this webinar. If anyone has to go early or anything, we'll be recording this. It's recording now, so it'll be available on our YouTube page afterwards. So yes, we're delighted to welcome everyone here today. We are joined by some fantastic speakers. We have a representative from ClientEarth, the Environmental Defenders Office, and Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth, Nigeria. So I will just introduce our speakers now. Before I do that, just to note that I'm joined today from Climate Case Ireland by Helena Murphy, and who will be helping us out with tech and monitoring the chat box. So if anyone has any issues, just let Helena know. And Matthew Mollihan, who will be moderating our Q&A session towards the end. And Clodagh Daly, who will be live tweeting the event. So ClientEarth, we have Paul Benson as our first speaker. ClientEarth is a legal organisation which uses the power of law to bring about systemic change that protects the earth for and with its inhabitants. They work in partnership across borders, systems and sectors, using the law to protect life on earth. They work to bring about end-to-end systemic change, informing, implementing and enforcing the law, advising decision makers on policy and training legal and judicial professionals. They work on climate accountability, using the law to hold government and businesses to account over climate change and to drive positive action. Paul Benson is a lawyer in ClientEarth's climate team. He focuses on strategic litigation and other legal interventions targeting companies in order to drive the transition to a low-carbon future. Prior to joining ClientEarth, Paul spent over 10 years in private practice, primarily in the London and Berlin offices of Freshfield Bruckhaus Deringer LLP, where he specialised in commercial litigation and contentious environmental matters. He's qualified as a solicitor in England and Wales with higher rights of audience. He's also a member of the Chamber of Lawyers in Berlin, where he's currently located, and he's coming to us live from Berlin now. Paul holds a BA in law from the University of Cambridge and is fluent in German. Next up we have from the Environmental Defenders Office, Bree Collins and Sean Ryan. So the Environmental Defenders Office, EDO, is the largest environmental legal centre in the Australia Pacific, dedicated to protecting our climate, communities and shared environment by providing access to justice, running groundbreaking litigation and leading law reform advocacy. They are an accredited community legal service and a non-governmental, not-for-profit organisation which uses the law to protect and defend Australia's wildlife, people and places. And from EDO we have Sean Ryan, who is the Managing Director of Safe Climate. Sean has degrees in both law and environmental science, as well as a Master's in Environmental Law from the University of Queensland. Having worked for all levels of government and a range of industries on a broad spectrum of environmental issues, Sean brings an experienced perspective to assisting the community in public interest. Sean worked for both government and in private consultancy before moving on to a 6-year stint in private law practice with Coors Chambers Westgarth. He joined EDO in 2011, where he worked mainly on climate change litigation, including appeals against thermal coal mines in the Galilee Basin, and leading an innovative new case for young people against the impact of climate change on their human rights from a draft government decision to approve a major new coal mine. Bree Collins is solicitor in Safe Climate at EDO. Bree graduated with a Bachelor of Arts and Laws from the University of Queensland in July this year and was admitted as a Queensland solicitor in September. Having a background in the Australian youth climate justice movement, she came to EDO as an undergraduate to implement her university research on avenues for climate change litigation under the new Queensland Human Rights Act. 2 years later, this continues to be her main work at EDO and has crystallised into the Galilee Coal Project case, Australia's first climate change and human rights case. Part-time, she's also employed by UQ to further her research on the intersection between climate change law and human rights. And finally then, we have from Environmental Rights Action, which is the Nigerian branch of Friends of the Earth. ERA is an advocacy non-governmental organisation which works on environmental human rights issues in Nigeria. They are the Nigerian chapter, as I said, of Friends of the Earth International, They dedicate themselves to the defence of human ecosystems in terms of human rights and to the promotion of environmentally responsible governmental, commercial, community and individual practice in Nigeria through the empowerment of local people. Their programme areas include corporate accountability, democracy outreach, energy and extractives, food sovereignty, environmental health and forest and biodiversity. They're the coordinating NGO in Africa for Oil Watch International, the Global South network of groups concerned about the effects of oil on the environment of people who live in oil-bearing regions. And we are joined from ERA by Chima Williams. Chima is a lawyer by profession and is an activist with ERA, having volunteered and then worked with them since 1993. Before beginning in his current role as acting executive director, earlier this year, Chima worked for many years as head of legal resources and democracy outreach at ERA. He is a practicing barrister and principal partner at Chima Williams and Associates. He's also president of Green Alliance Nigeria and is in his second term as an editorial board member of Business and Human Rights Journal, published by Cambridge University Press in London. Chima is the country focal person and regional chairman of the Publicity Committee of Public Interest Lawyering Initiative for West Africa. So that sums up our fantastic panel of guests today. And before we begin, just to note that there will be a Q&A box function during the webinar where questions can be submitted to panelists. If you see a question that you would like to be answered or is similar to one that you have yourself, you can upvote the question and the most upvoted questions will be asked at the end. And also just to note then that recordings from this webinar, along with all the other webinars in this series, are being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So we begin then, and I would like to invite Paul Benson from ClientEarth to be our first speaker. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us and to all our panelists for taking part today. Thanks. So, Paul.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'm wary that we're slightly tight for time, so I'm just going to jump straight in. So what I'd really like to focus on in the time available is corporate climate litigation, of course, some of the trends, but in particular some of our experiences at ClientEarth, and one case in particular that I think serves as a really good and helpful example of the type of work that we do and how we're trying to hold businesses to account in respect of climate change. So in terms of those trends that I mentioned, I think we've come quite a long way in terms of corporate climate litigation since the 2000s and even the early 2010s. In the last few years, we have come quite away from those public nuisance and tort type actions in the US, which were largely unsuccessful at that time for various reasons, including causation and including the tendency of the courts in the US all the way up to the Supreme Court to say that the climate change and climate change litigation was rather a matter for the legislature in the US and governed by the Clean Air Act, and to the extent that the legislature wanted to take action, it was free to do so. But climate change litigation, I think, on the basis of those public nuisance tort types legal bases, wasn't particularly successful, frankly, in the early 2000s. We're seeing that change, I think, and we're seeing that develop, and not just against states. Clearly, Friends of the Irish Environment, kind enough to host this webinar, have had fantastic success against the Republic of Ireland, and there's been other successful litigation over the last few years against states. But also in terms of corporate litigation, in terms of climate litigation against companies, I think we're seeing that field develop quite rapidly, and I think there's a lot of factors behind that. The first, undoubtedly, is the development in parallel of climate attribution science, which has allowed potential claimants to really pinpoint and quantify the environmental impact that businesses and companies might be having with their emissions. Probably the starkest example of that is here in Germany. There's a case currently pending before the regional court of Hamm in Germany here. Case brought by a Peruvian farmer and a group of Peruvian farmers against the energy utility RWE. And that claim effectively, without trying to oversimplify it, it requests that RWE compensate the Peruvian farmers for the repair costs and damage to their homes that will be caused and is being caused by climate change. And it attributes 0.47% of that damage that is being caused to the emissions generated by RWE's operations. Now, clearly that's a very precise figure, 0.47%, but that kind of scientific analysis, that climate attribution, I think in the last few decades, that just wouldn't have been possible. And that case has been allowed to proceed to the evidentiary stage here in Germany. So that's one development underlying the trend. I think another is that potential claimants have become increasingly inventive in terms of the types of claims that they're bringing against companies. And as I said, those public nuisance tort claims in the US, they didn't really get off the ground for the reasons that I mentioned. But we're seeing litigation being founded on different bases now. That inventiveness you're seeing in the UK, but also elsewhere, in terms of trying to hold parent companies liable for the environmental harms caused by their foreign subsidiaries. So that is an emerging and an interesting field of litigation. It faces some hurdles, and we've seen that recently in the UK Samco litigation. But I think it will continue to develop. Another factor, I think, behind this evolution of the way in which litigation is brought against companies is that companies are having to start waking up to climate risk, and in particular to the material financial risks that climate change creates for them. And that's what I'd like to focus on for the remaining time allocated, because that's something that we at ClientEarth in our climate accountability program, we really specialize in looking at those material financial risks and using the power of corporate and financial laws to hold companies to account. Now, the way in which we do that is really by using pretty standardized corporate law principles across Europe and indeed across the world. Now, clearly, corporate legal frameworks will differ by jurisdiction. It won't be identical in the UK as it is in Germany, and in fact, they can be quite different. But generally, you will find, in respect of the really core principles of corporate law, and in particular directors' duties and companies' duties, you will find similarities. Now, some of those similarities are that companies and financial institutions are generally required to identify, to manage, to report on material financial risks. And it's becoming increasingly clear that climate change is one of those material financial risks. Directors have general legal duties to act in the best interest of the company, to disclose those material risks in financial filings, to act with reasonable care and skill and diligence. And investors also have fiduciary duties to their beneficiaries where financial evidence shows that losses have arisen or losses are likely to arise. And this all plays into what are the risks of climate change. And those are manifold for business. You have physical risk in terms of the effect on company infrastructure or assets. You have transition risk, where companies are really maybe not catching up quickly enough with new regulation or new technologies, and are going to suffer as a result in the market. Their financial position is going to suffer, and that brings into play these duties that I mentioned. And perhaps just to give that a bit of flavour, or to put some flesh on the bones of that, because it can all sound a little bit abstract. But one of the cases that we recently brought, I think, was a really good illustration of how those types of corporate and financial law duties can be used. And that is against a Polish energy utility. ClientEarth pursued a claim as shareholder in the Polish energy utility that I mentioned, and there was a joint venture between this Polish energy utility and another Polish energy company, both majority held in terms of their stakeholding by the Polish state. And that joint venture had proposed a new 1 gigawatt coal plant in Poland, effectively a huge new coal plant at a time where coal is becoming increasingly risky in terms of its investment potential, and that's what we focused on. Well, what is the potential profits of this new coal plant? What are the financial returns? And that was the basis of our claim. Had a viable interest in ensuring that the companies weren't left with a stranded asset in the form of this coal plant. Now, there was widespread market concern about the idea that this huge new coal plant would be built. It was pushed by the Polish state, and as I said, the Polish state was majority shareholder in these two companies. But investors were coming out and saying, look, this isn't a viable project. This isn't going to be profitable. And so in our capacity as shareholder, we filed that legal challenge to revoke the company's decision, really. We filed a challenge against the company's decision to greenlight the project to build this new coal plant. And it was supported by expert economic analysis. We commissioned expert evidence which supported the idea that this plant would just be a stranded asset. It wouldn't make money for the company. The company would be ploughing billions of euros into this project. In fact, 1.2 billion euros into this project, a huge amount of money, and it wouldn't generate any return for shareholders. And that was the basis of our claim before the Polish court, using those corporate and financial law strategies. Now, the result of that claim, as I understand it, was a world first, whereby the Polish court upheld our claim. It annulled the resolution which had been taken by the company which consented to the construction of the coal plant. And that judgment was then upheld on appeal. And the court also granted at first instance our separate claim for disclosure of documents. We asked the companies, look, we don't see how this plant could be viable. We've got economic analysis showing that this plant can't be viable. Please tell us as shareholder, how do you see this plant being profitable? And the company couldn't respond to that and didn't want to respond to that because that evidence didn't exist. And so we also filed a parallel claim for disclosure of that information as shareholder, and that claim was also successful at first instance. It's now the subject of appeal, but the impact of that claim, I think, not just in Poland, but across the market, was quite significant. The funding to the plant was suspended as a result of our claim. The plant has now been cancelled. There is talk of the plant being converted to gas, but the plant as it was envisaged has been cancelled. And there were write-downs at the companies who chose to proceed with this decision of over 1 billion Polish currency. And so I think that just illustrates the risks that companies do face and are increasingly going to face. And those risks, as the material risk of climate change materializes and increasingly becomes evident through climate attribution science, I think the risk of that litigation on companies is just going to increase exponentially over the next few years. I think probably I've spoken for long enough. I look forward to hearing any questions, and I'll pass over to the next speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for those contributions. Really fascinating. Yeah, if Bree or Sean were ready to speak next, in whichever order you prefer, we'd love to hear now.
I might kick it off, if that's all right.
Thanks, and thanks again, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Emma. Yeah, so I did have some slides, but in the interest of recovering some time, I might forego that. Emma already did a great introduction for EDO, Community Legal Centre, not-for-profit. We do very similar work to ClientEarth and Earth Justice. So I wanted to give a bit of an intro of the Australian context before Bree was going to get into more detail of one of our signature cases in relation to human rights. And I think one of the key things to understand with the Australian context for climate litigation is that Australia is a major exporter of coal and gas, both thermal and metallurgical. So while our domestic emissions are around 500 million tonnes per year, we export fossil fuels mainly to Asia that have embedded emissions called Scope 3 emissions of over 1 billion tonnes per annum. So two-thirds of our emissions are actually exported to overseas. While if you look at the latest World Energy Outlook report for 2020, if we wanted a trajectory to stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, we would need to reduce coal consumption, for example, by 40% by 2030. However, Australia currently has 80 fossil fuel projects listed as feasible and 40 of those winding their way through the application process. If those projects are approved, they would expand our fossil fuel exports by 500 million tonnes per annum. So we are, Australia's context, we're looking at expanding our emissions through our fossil fuel exports. Not so much in our domestic emissions. We're doing okay on our domestic emissions and we'll probably continue to improve our domestic emissions. So a lot of the focus for our clients in Australia has been on that fossil fuel expansion, and in particular thermal coal as the most vulnerable of the fossil fuels, because there is readily available alternatives in solar and wind, which is now cheaper. So a lot of the litigation that we've been running over the last 10 years has been in relation to those fossil fuels, and particularly efforts to open up new coal basins. And one of them here in Queensland is the Galilee Basin. And there's several very large mines planned in the Galilee Basin. One is the Adani Carmichael mine, which is planned to be 60 million tonnes per annum of coal exports at full production, which is about 144 million tonnes per annum of greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than 20% of our domestic emissions. So, for this reason, a lot of clients have been interested in trying to put the brakes on that fossil fuel expansion, as opposed to going after the government for reducing their domestic emissions target, which would have, ultimately less effect on the climate. So, we've had a dozen or two cases for clients here in Australia, and we've managed to establish that the climate science is now readily accepted. It was initially resisted that an individual project would have a significant enough impact on a global scale to be considered significant. That is now overcome. Courts now readily accept that climate change is real, it's a relevant consideration. An individual project is significant enough to be of concern, and indeed last year in New South Wales, climate change was a basis for refusal, one of the bases for refusal of a coal mine. So we've sort of turning the corner in terms of our climate litigation against projects. And going against projects is a little bit unfashionable, but it is also challenging a government decision, and the corporation is the defendant, and it does keep emissions in the ground. So in that context, I've been running in the EDO office climate litigation for about 10 years. We're always looking at new ways that we can bring the impacts of climate change to the court, new perspectives. And just this year, the Human Rights Act commenced in Queensland, and at the time, a UQ student, Bree Collins, did a research paper and came into me to pitch an idea. And so I might hand over to Bree, who came up with the idea for this latest case that she's going to talk in a bit more detail about.
Hi everyone, so I'm Bree from the EDO. It's lovely to be here and amazing to be talking alongside some incredible lawyers. Before I do start, I would quickly like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, whose sovereignty over this land was never ceded. So I'm in a city called Meanjin, also known as Brisbane, in Queensland. And I just want to acknowledge that for many First Nations people, the environmental crisis that we're all talking about now has actually been going on for hundreds of years since colonization. So I'm obviously a very young lawyer and have considerably less experience than the other people on this panel, but that youth also puts me in an interesting position of proximity to the young people who are working on the front lines of the climate crisis and young people who are working all over the world using their various skills to hold corporations accountable for their contributions to climate change. So my way of doing this at the moment has been my contribution to the Youth Verdict and Bimblebox Alliance case against Clive Palmer's Galley coal project, smack bang in the middle of Queensland. And you can read much more about that case online and about our amazing clients, and I encourage you to. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk to you about 3 considerations and things that I consider to be important in the case. Partially because of time, partially because I've heard that no one remembers more than 3 things from a webinar anyway. So the first thing that I'd really love to talk about is what I find interesting about our case is we're using human rights, but we're kind of sidestepping a really massive issue in corporate accountability. And that's the fact that corporations actually don't have human rights obligations to us. So they have scattered legislation in fair work and non-discrimination legislation, but they do not have a cohesive human rights obligation. And this is in contradiction to the fact that they have an enormous power, and some would say power that actually in today's society rivals states, which do have checks and balances through various administrative justice processes. But in our case, we're getting around this because we're objecting to an environmental approval and a mining lease of a company on grounds of human rights breaches. So we're actually arguing that a company's contributions to climate change are breaching human rights. But the way that we're doing that is via the land court, and the land court makes recommendation of seeing all of the evidence that we're going to bring and then make a recommendation approved or rejected. So in this way, we're able to use government processes, but actually shift the dialogue to link direct climate impacts to contributions of individual companies to climate change fighting. So the second thing I'd like to briefly mention is that we are working under a fairly small regional human rights act, and yet our case has pretty amazing international significance. The first reason for that, Sean's already touched on. Queensland is an absolute centre for extractive industries and a huge contributor to the coal market and coal exports in general. But as well as that significance rippling out, there is your international significance, I guess, rippling in. And that's because traditionally, Australia has been very conservative in terms of allowing foreign law to be imported into Australian law. However, under the Queensland Human Rights Act, we are given explicit authority to use international law and domestic law of international countries to actually interpret our own rights in Queensland. So that means we're able to use amazing cases, we're able to use cases overseas where good links have been made between culture and environment, and to use those cases where the boom of human rights law has been happening in relation to climate change overseas. That's exciting, especially because we're one of the first human rights cases in Queensland, and certainly one of the first to link climate change to human rights. So we have a lot of power to shape that narrative in this case. And then the third important thing, and I think definitely what is most important to me, is that as well as having international significance, we also have enormous domestic significance, and this case is distinctly a Queensland case. So our human rights arguments are largely based on those people in our community that are very much on the front lines of climate change impacts. And they're also at the intersection of the majority of the human rights which we're alleging are violated. And those people are, of course, the First Nations people in Queensland. And in the Human Rights Act, the cultural rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are distinct, and they're also fairly strongly articulated. So I will very quickly share my screen to show you what I mean, rather than just tell you, so that you can have a look at the Queensland legislation yourself. So as you can see, the cultural rights of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples are distinct. What I find really important when looking at this legislation is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Queensland don't just have rights to enjoy, maintain, control, and protect rights. They also have the rights to develop their rights, to develop their culture into future generations. And that's really important, because although it could be argued maybe that in 50 years' time, First Nations Australians will be able to hold on to the scraps of their culture, the contributions to climate change are certainly not going to help them develop that culture and to make it stronger. The other really important point is 28.2e, to conserve and protect the environment and productive capacity of the land. That's important because it's the only right in the Queensland Human Rights Act which comes close to being a right to the environment. So I'll now just stop sharing my screen. So this is quite different from native title law, which is really important because native title law in Australia requires very onerous proof of an unbroken chain of cultural practice. This is obviously despite the fact that the breaks in the chain have been caused by the white man's law itself. So cultural rights is a far broader articulation of varied First Nations experiences than we've probably ever had in Queensland. So I can't speak for other people's countries as to specific impacts they're feeling because they're not my countries. But what I do quickly want to do, because some people from an international audience might not know, is share this map of Queensland that many people wouldn't have seen. But it demonstrates that so-called Queensland is actually a collection of an enormous amount of clans, nations, and tribes, which all have unique cultures, which are all connected to unique ecosystems. And of course, where culture is inextricable from the environment, you can just imagine the knock-on effects of the ecological demise on these cultures, and also the power of the evidence that can be brought in video form and evidence on country and written word. So the most exciting part of this case for me is that we need to bring all of these stories into the court so the court can be bent towards these different perspectives which tell stories that are thousands of years old and that are deeply connected to the land in a way that can't be compared to short-term economics and short-term jobs. So in my view, these are stories that the court maybe hasn't seen before, and this is an opportunity to tell them. And I think I've talked very much enough, so I'd like to pass on to Chima now. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Bree, for that. And I think it's really important as well that you acknowledged, you know, that sovereignty was never ceded to the First Nations people. And I think it's really fascinating because to see the map of Indigenous Queensland for many people outside of Australia, I think they might not be as aware, and it's really poignant to see. So thank you for sharing that with us too. And just to note on time also, because we're obviously over time because of the technical issue at the start, we might run maybe 10 minutes or so over time if that suits everyone. And with that in mind, Chima, I'd like to pass over to you and hear from the Nigerian Perspectives. And thanks very much, Bree.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, my co-panelists. And those that have joined us on this webinar. For us, it's been a long journey, trying to bring corporates accountable for their misdeeds in our communities, in our country, in terms of environmental damages arising from different factors, including the issue of pollution and the seeming powerlessness of our governments, to hold these corporate entities accountable and responsible. This lays the background for the two cases that we've done prominently in terms of holding corporates accountable under the Nigerian government. One of the cases is the case of oil spill that we had to drag the multinational Shell to her home country for determination of their destructions in our communities, for them to be held accountable, because in Nigeria, Shell proves to be above the law, that they can threaten the government, the entire national government. Shell can have the audacity and boldness to threaten the government that, look, except you do this, we are not going to do this. And if we don't do it, you will not have resources to run your administration, and the country will be in trouble. So such threats comes from corporate entities that believe that they are bigger than the government and the people of the country that host them. Fortunately for us, on that case, which involved 4 Nigerian farmer fishermen against RODS, Royal Dutch Shell, and Shell Development Petroleum Company Nigeria Limited, SPDC, the daughter company in Nigeria, which case had been in the court in Holland since 2008, thereabouts, and we secured mixed judgments at the court of first instance, where the decision was split. The court found in favor of one of the fishermen, farmers from Ikoradaudo community, the Friday Happen, and then found against the other 3, Chief Tete Barizadu, who died in course of the litigation and had been replaced by his son, Eric Bariza, Alali Efanga from Oruma community, who equally is demised in course of the case, and Chief Fidelis Oguru. The court ruled against them, but we are on appeal, and the good thing is that the cases have been concluded at the Court of Appeal. Judgment was to be delivered this December, but the court postponed the date to January 29th, 2021 for judgment in the case. That gives some kind of hope, that because, of course, with that case, we had set a global standard in terms of jurisdictional questions. The court, the Court of First Instance and the Court of Appeal in The Hague had accepted that they have jurisdiction to hear cases against Dutch companies operating outside of the shores of Dutch lands for their environmental misbehaviors. So that sets a global standard, and for us, it is a starting point. And of course, having gotten a favorable judgment in one of the cases where Shell was held responsible to the community and the victim, the Friday Akpan, is equally a positive for us. So building on that, we're expecting that because we've made all our arguments and tried to find evidence to prove some of the issues that led the lower courts to go against us in some of the other cases, and we're optimistic that at the appeal level, the justices of the Court of Appeal in The Hague will look at it differently. So that is on that. But coming to the key, which is the case that talks about climate change, which is the case of John Agbemre against Shell, the case that we did at the National Court. First is that before this case came up, nobody considered in Nigeria that the issue of gas flaring can be litigated against, let alone getting a decision outlawing gas flaring. And the background to that was that before I joined Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth Nigeria in 2004, in 2003, I was one of the 3 lawyers that were commissioned by Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth Nigeria to conduct a research and advise the organization on the legality or constitutionality or otherwise of gas flaring. And as it was, when we came out with our findings, we had a split finding. 2 of us came to the conclusion that gas flaring is unconstitutional because the provisions for flaring gas was an exception to the rule. But the other lawyer found that by the provisions of the Associated Gas Reinjection Act, that gas flaring was legal and constitutional. So possibly that was one of the reasons why I was engaged to join Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth Nigeria as a lawyer, because that was the first legal assignment that was given to me. Okay, your opinion was that gas flaring is illegal, so prove it. And that is how we developed the case. And I had to source for other lawyers, especially a senior advocate of Nigeria, an intelligent one for that matter, because at the point before the commencement of the case, he was voted the most intelligent senior lawyer in his jurisdiction by the Nigerian Bar Association of that jurisdiction. So we engaged BAI 104 to lead us, and then we did the research together. So, but the good news is that it was the first case ever to have come from Nigeria against gas flaring. It was the first case ever to have mentioned climate change as climate impact as a violation of citizens' rights in Nigeria, and it still remains the only case that have so mentioned, okay? And we proceeded with the case. We had to look at, as had already been presented by my co-panelists, you know, when you want to litigate against these multinationals who has large war chest of funds, you have to decide which area do you have comparative advantage, you know, to be able to bring your case and let it be heard. Okay, so we made that analysis and decided that we are going to come by way of enforcement of fundamental rights. Okay, because from our analysis, a violation of constitutional provisions, you know, amounts to a violation of rights. And where we hinged our claim was that gas flaring constitutes a health issue, health problem, because it creates a lot of attendant health challenges that citizens within the areas where it is being operated suffer from. So, and if your health is tampered with by whatever means, our position was that that violates your right to life and dignity of the human person. And of course, we went ahead to interpret to the court or show the court that, look, there is already an existing position that right to life does not only is not only violated when somebody is either shot dead or killed by whatever means, but that any activity, any action that impairs the full enjoyment of the faculties of life amounts to violation of right to life. Okay, so, and we made that argument and the court agreed with us. And that is the basis of the issue of flaring, fundamental rights, and climate change. You know, creating the nexus between these three in terms of protecting citizens' rights. So we have had that decision. Funny thing is that this decision was made in 2005. And prior to the filing of the case, Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth Nigeria, in collaboration with Climate Justice England, had come up with a publication arising from the researches that we conducted, because while we did the legal research on gas flaring, some did historical research and some did health research on impact of gas flaring. And we came out with a publication that was called Gas Flaring in Nigeria, a Human Rights, Environmental and Economic Monstrosity. That was in 2005. And now, when this judgment was delivered, Shell, rather than obey this law, because the court ordered gas flaring to stop forthwith. Of course, Shell had the right to make an appeal if they want, and therefore Shell came to court and asked for a stay of execution of the judgment, because it was from a court of competent jurisdiction, though court of first instance, a superior court of record, Federal High Court, sitting in Benin City. And when Shell came up with the application for stay of execution, the court looked at it and said, okay, because of the technical nature of ending gas flaring, I will grant you a stay of execution within 1 year, and you are to come to court before me to show me a scheme of plan of action that within 1 year that I am going to excuse you, you are able to put off the last gas flaring in respect of this judgment. And this is where the denial game started by Shell. Shell, rather than follow that, went to the Court of Appeal to stop that exhibition hearing. It was called exhibition hearing because Shell was to come to court to exhibit before the court their scheme of plan to end gas flaring within 1 year, from 2015 November to April, something to 2016 ending, okay, so that the judgment would have been given full effect. But Shell went to Court of Appeal to stop that exhibition hearing and went to town to argue that they have that judgment had been stopped, and that is why they are not obeying that judgment. And we commenced first of its kind, because this gas flaring case of John Agbemre against Shell had a lot of precedent-setting positions, because that was the first time the MD of Shell, the GMD of NNPC, the Nigerian JIV partner with Shell, were to be committed to prison for disobedience to court order. And in fact, the GMD of Shell, then Funshoku Basil Omiyi, was served with Form 48 notice of notice requiring him to show cause why he should not be committed to prison. Okay, and that strengthened the arms of Shell to take all means and all pattern to ensure that the case, the Court of Appeal stops the exhibition hearing and the rest of them. So, but one thing instructive is that Shell lived in denial that the judgment in John Agbenre against Shell was no longer enforceable against them. But 13 years or thereabout after, Shell is in the Court of Appeal to ask the Court of Appeal, to set aside the judgment that they have claimed for 13 years was no longer in existence. So presently, we are at the Court of Appeal to defend that judgment. But something very fundamental, because when we do the actions that we do as civil society platforms, we must equally look at what are the benefits of our activities. What has it changed? What changes has come as a result of the little work we do? For the gas flaring case, the number one thing was that it helped to mobilize the Nigerian National Assembly, especially the Senate of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, in 2008 to pass the Gas Flaring Prohibition and Punishment Bill that sought to prohibit continued flaring of gas in Nigeria, because that was one of the orders of the courts that the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation should liaise with all other relevant authorities to ensure that a clear law prohibiting gas flaring is enacted in Nigeria. And that came up. After that, in 2018, the present federal government enacted the Flare Gas Prevention of Waste and Pollution Regulations 2018, with its opening declaring gas flaring is prohibited. So, and of course, the present government in 2016, when they enacted their economic recovery and growth plan, centered on making zero gas flare in the country by utilizing the gas flares to grow the economy. So for us, these are positive steps and positive impacts of that litigation, even though it is still ongoing. And lastly, I know that I've spoken for too long, but last thing that I want to point out is that, curiously, at the Court of Appeal, Shell had joined the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation as co-respondents with us. Okay, in the first instance case, we sued the Office of the Attorney General as the Chief Law Officer of the Federation alongside Shell for allowing gas flaring to continue. But Shell on appeal now separated themselves from the Office of the Attorney General and added him to join us as co-respondents. It's very instructive. So I think I will pause here, and if there are questions, I'll be glad to take them. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chima. That was so interesting. Really appreciate those contributions. And before I pass over to Matthew for the Q&A, and we will be finishing up very soon. Sorry, I'm aware that Australia, it's very late at night. But yeah, just to ask myself before we go to the Q&A panel, I wanted to ask to Paul and Chima, in terms of holding the polluters accountable, how important has an international kind of influence and pressure been for you, and also international cooperation? So if I could direct that to Paul and Chima first of all, and also then I'd like to come to Sean and Bree and just to ask, in terms of your support base, how important has the influence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the youth voice been for you? So I might just come to Paul and Chima first for that. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. Happy to have a first stab at that one. I think it's a really good question. I think that the very nature of climate change, it sounds very trite, but it's cross-border, it's international. There's no way in which one piece of legislation or litigation in one jurisdiction can even come close to resolving the issue. And therefore, the type of international collaboration that you mentioned is absolutely critical. And in the litigation field, you see it, I think, increasingly, that precedents which are made in one jurisdiction can be utilized and leveraged in other jurisdictions. I think we're still, I think, at the sort of early phase. We're sort of still in the trenches, if you like, in terms of getting climate corporate litigation really up and running. And I think over the next few years, you will see it, as I said, increasing exponentially. But to give a couple of examples, I think on the state side, the agenda litigation in the Netherlands a few years ago has been cited very frequently in other pieces of litigation around the world against states. I believe it was also used as, or at least informing the thinking behind Climate Case Ireland. I think we see it on a company level as well. I mentioned when I was speaking earlier about parent companies potentially being liable for the environmental harms committed by their subsidiaries. That is an idea which I think is now reverberating around the globe. And it's that type of international collaboration. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a hugely successful piece of litigation in order for it to have impact. It's the very idea sometimes, the very concept that these parent companies could be liable for the environmental harms of their foreign subsidiaries that can have a significant impact. And so just perhaps final point, the Samco litigation recently in the UK that I also mentioned, that didn't get off the ground in the UK because the English High Court determined that England and Wales wasn't the proper jurisdiction or wasn't the proper forum in the event for that claim to proceed in England, and it was referred in effect to the Brazilian courts to determine. But I think we'll see increasingly the need for international collaboration, the fact that these issues are cross-boundary, and hopefully, I mean, in terms of that one particular specific point, we will see parent companies in due course being held liable for environmental harms of their foreign subsidiaries, because I think that could have a really significant and rippling effect across the market.
Thanks. Chima, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for that insight. For us, in terms of international cooperation, we have enjoyed massive the cooperation of other actors across the world. Because one point is that from our own background, where pressure, external pressure on even our government plays a critical role, in ensuring that they are moved to do the needful. We cannot do actually without it. And of course, when we consider that the issues that we are dealing with are products, local products that have global consequences, because climate change impact knows no boundary. So any contribution to the exacerbation of climate impact, is a global phenomenon. So in this, from the onset, we had determined the place of international solidarity and cooperation in these works. And we have done this effectively. As I mentioned, the starting of the John Agbemre's case, we worked together with Climate Justice Program, UK, okay, and other Friends of the Earth partners. And in the Dutch case, we are doing it with Milieu Defensie, Friends of the Earth Netherlands, who is also a party to the suit as an NGO on ground in Netherlands. So, and all our Friends of the Earth International partners and members are all part of, whatever we are doing, and we solicit and seek for advice, support from other global organizations. We worked with Earth Rights International, in some cases. We connect with LIDE in some instances, and of course, Advocate for Community Alternatives, works with us. So we create that global leverage that helps us to amplify the voices from Nigeria. And that is the only way, because I teach my colleagues, younger colleagues, that look, if we must fight the multinationals, there is no other way we can do it other than to go multinational too, okay? So that is the only way our pressure can bear on them. So we understand the place of international solidarity, mobilization, and cooperation to be able to change the situations that we are up against. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Chima. Sean, we might just come to you quickly on that other point, if that's all right, and then we'll pass on, and Lena actually will do the Q&A.
If I can also have 10 seconds on the international dimension to climate litigation from an Australian perspective, because I really liked and want to echo what Paul and Chima were saying there. Certainly we take up decisions around the world, and the first refusal of a coal mine on climate change grounds in Australia cited Urgenda and Wild Earth Guardians and some of the other big climate litigation cases around the world. We ourselves have taken inspiration, particularly from the Juliana case in the United States, with designing our youth climate case. International policy efforts such as China, Japan and South Korea agreeing to net zero emissions affects the market for Australian coal, which impacts on our cases, and indeed Boris Johnson and Biden in the United States taking a more proactive position on climate has forced our politicians to take it. So it's very much a global two-way ecosystem. But turning to your question about First Nations and youth and our supporter base, yeah, certainly we're we've taken inspiration from that, and there's because they are groups that stand to suffer some of the greatest impacts from climate change, both because the First Nations people are living very closely connected to this country and feel the impacts quite severely, and our youngest citizens because they will live through the worst impacts of climate change. So, those have definitely been strong groups that we have reached out to, And we've had a really good response. We act on donations. We rely on donations to run our cases. So when we've explained the impacts on those groups and sought donations to enable our cases to be filed, we've had a good response from our supporter base. Bree's more connected to those groups in more way. So Bree might be able to add more detail to that.
I lost you at the end there, Sean, so I'm not sure what I'm adding more detail to.
Anything else you want?
Can you repeat? Dropped
out. Oh, just that you know those First Nations and youth are two groups that suffer the worst impacts, both temporarily and spatially, from climate change. So they've been really strong clients and witnesses, and our supporters have seen the strength of those stories, and that's enabled us to, through donations, bring those stories forward. But I was just passing to you because I know you've been working more directly with those clients and witnesses and might have additional perspective to add.
Well, yeah, I agree with all of that. And I suppose just quickly what I would say is, especially when it comes to First Nations people who we've been working with, I think the amplification of First Nations voices is a combination of, it's legal benefits, it's ethical benefits, and its strategic benefits, both on the campaign side of things and also the legal side of things. I briefly mentioned that First Nations people are very much at the intersection of all of the rights that we're looking at. And in some ways that makes them the perfect voices and also the perfect case studies, especially if you take a young First Nations person. That person is going to be sitting at the intersection of the cultural rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the right to life, the best interests of the child, property rights, you name it. They can pretty much touch upon so many of those things because of the unique position that they have on country. And more than that, the flip side of that is, of course, they're the people who experience the worst impacts of climate change first. And of course, in many cases, they have contributed the least to it. And a lot of people are frustrated in that sense and make comments like, if we had been listened to, if our methods of sustainability had been listened to, this wouldn't be happening, and yet we're facing the worst impacts. And for me, that's really hard hitting, and that kind of frustration is something that I couldn't possibly understand. And so for me, it's really important that we amplify those voices both legally, and that the first human rights and climate change case in Australia puts First Nations voices at the very forefront, and then that to be echoed on the campaign trail as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much for those comments, Bree, Sean, Paul and Chima. I'm going to pass over to Helena now to get started on the audience Q&A. So Helena, over to you. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Emer, and thanks to all our fantastic speakers. I know I understand we're quite limited in time, so I will try to ask maybe the panelists their views on possibly two questions here. So Hugo Thompson has asked, is he in the context where Ireland's climate law is currently being drafted, essentially what the panelists' views would be on the role of putting in place a new law or amending existing laws or statutes to take account of the responsibility of the fossil fuel industry for the damage that they've caused to the environment. And I suppose linked to that then would just be the if there's they'd see no effective role for any new or existing statutes in place to take account of that responsibility, whether there's other ways of getting those companies to pay for the damage that they've caused, and what the best way would be, for example, maybe to fund communities to or through net zero solutions. So we'd like to hear the views of the panelists on those issues, if possible. So just if any of the speakers have any views really on what is the best role of holding the oil companies to account, whether it's through laws or other means.
I can pitch in. I mean, I'm certainly no expert in Irish law. Yeah, look, legal cases can be great, but they are only ever one component of the action. I think we're never going to get all the way there with litigation alone. It requires government action and citizen action and all the aspects to be working together. I mean, I would be interested in in Irish corporate law, because there is a lot of global structures for tax purposes that have, at least in the past, used Ireland as part of a tax structure. So, I always wondered if you can get at some of the corporations by when they're listed, in Ireland or in one of these countries for tax purposes, if they have an entity within your jurisdiction, if that provides an opportunity to impose some sort of climate obligations as part of their registration as a company within the jurisdiction. Just a random idea.
Great. Thanks.
Just to address the point very, very briefly, perhaps where we're time, around, I think the question tailed off around, well, what is the best course of action? What is the best route? Is it locally? Is it with the regional government? Is it within your own community? Is it on a national level? I think just on that point, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think there are means and paths to action at all of those levels that were mentioned in the question. And from my perspective, I think provided that NGOs and civil society organisations are broadly aligned, and one of those routes doesn't necessarily undermine in some way another of those routes, there's no reason that I see why pressure could not be put on at each and every one of those levels.
Agreed. I like the phrase, every straw breaks the camel's back, not just the last straw. So everyone just does what they can, and the collective weight is what achieves the change at the end of the day.
Great. Oh, if neither Bree or Chima have any points to add there, if otherwise, we'll just quickly just ask the panelists if they have any. Just this other question by Judy Osborne, asking about whether any of the panelists can provide any examples of corporations who have taken a more, I suppose, have changed their approach in terms of sustainability or the environment without the threat of litigation, such as that litigation which Chima has discussed so thoroughly. So have we any positive examples in the absence of litigation? We could.
Paul might have better ones. I'll let Paul go first. I think it's probably more your area than mine.
Sure, thanks, Sean. The example that sprung to mind immediately was Ørsted, the company now called Ørsted, the Danish utility. It used to be a company called Dong, a Danish state entity focused on oil and natural gas, hence the name Dong. And it's rebranded to Ørsted some years ago, and really, I think, moved its entire centre of operations around from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It's now the world's largest producer of offshore wind. Now, I don't want this to come across as any kind of pitch for Ørsted, but I do think they are broadly a good example of the type of pivot that companies will need to make, and energy utilities in particular, towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. And it just so happens, I think, that Ørsted have made that switch rather sooner than the other large energy utility companies. And I think that approach has paid off for them. Now, whether that approach was informed by market forces, by profitability analyses, by the spectre of litigation, by the other manifold risks that arise from climate change, is difficult to say. I suspect, as Sean was saying, it's a combination of all of them. but I think they're a good example of the type of company that has changed their operations, notwithstanding that the regulation wasn't necessarily there yet to force them into doing that.
I can add an Australian perspective too, which is very similar. We've had quite an interesting experience with, this wave of corporate litigation that Paul's been talking about. There was a very prominent QC was asked for an opinion about climate risks and corporate responsibilities and directors' duties, and that opinion was published saying that there is a duty to consider climate risks. And because that QC was quite well respected, that was taken up by our financial regulators and our Reserve Bank, and it became accepted wisdom. And that really shifted the culture, corporate culture in Australia. And a lot of our corporations have started reporting on and assessing climate risk. Now, the litigation acts like, the wolves that help change the course of the river by finding the ones that are falling behind and going after those. And there's been a couple of very strategic actions run against, firstly against the Commonwealth Bank, and that settled before it got to court because the Commonwealth Bank decided to report on those risks before there was a reported judgment. And it's the same lawyer, David Barnden from Equity Generation Lawyers, went after a superannuation fund, Rest Super, for a young person on similar grounds. And again, that settled before it got to a court judgment because the super decided to assess risk. And now we've seen the other super companies and other banks in Australia start to incorporate climate risk because, whether that's fear of litigation or whether that's just the market moving for all of the forces, it's hard to say. But, you definitely see a bigger culture shift as a result of, some targeted interventions. It's quite effective, but some will do it. There's plenty of leaders that go ahead of the curve that don't respond to the litigation. But, I think it helps having some wolves at their heels.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Chima, you go.
Yeah, okay. I will talk a little bit on Google's questions, and I think there can be no better way than to pursue for claims of damages, from the corporates, because in the first instance, communities and victims of their environmental misbehavior will not go to court if they were responsive and responsible to them. Okay, so it leaves you with the only option of trying using the law to compel them to do what ordinarily they should have done. On the issue of the second question by Judy, on if there's any example of corporates that have changed their style as a result of threats to litigation and the rest of them without change in the law. Yes, even though we don't want to celebrate such, but what we are taught is to speak the truth the way it is. So even if a corporate have been a number one enemy because of their misbehavior, if they do anything that we think others should emulate, we say it. In course of my work or our work in our organization, I know that we have moved Eni to sort of first in history for a corporation to agree to go back to site. They have claimed that they have cleaned up and they claim to have regulatory authority certification of cleaning up that environment. But because we threatened to go to court in Italy, they were ready to go back with us to inspect the site to agree whether it is clean or not. That change of behavior, because any Nigerian oil company is one of the most stubborn companies in the history of Nigeria that does not even want to listen to anybody. But since we started that action, we've seen them begin to do at least talk with the people in little tokens. But we think that more needs to be done if they want to really show that they are changing. Okay, but the fact that they agree to go back to sites is a change for us. And in another case, we started against them. That actually was an OECD complaint mechanism case. Of course, they agreed to undo the damage that they had done in a community where they have resisted undoing that damage for close to 40 years. Okay, so I think the answer to this is that the more we get organized and use the power of the law, the more we can cause them to change, because they will never change simply because they want to or because they like it, but they will change if we put our forces together and compel them.
Thanks very much, Chima. Bree, would you like to give us some final words before we hand over to Emer?
Yes, I will be very quick, but all I wanted to do was give a quick shout out to mass social movements on the basis of Judy's question, because I do think the power that mass social movements have had in influencing corporations and their behaviour is actually really amazing. And in Queensland and Australia, one really good example of that is Adani. It's quite well known internationally. You may have heard of the Adani mine, massive coal mine in Queensland. And the Stop Adani movement has been one of the biggest environmental movements across Australia. And hundreds, thousands of volunteers and people, as well as organisations, basically managed to convince the 4 major banks of Australia to withdraw from funding the bank, targeted many different contractors, many different insurers, and really effectively actually push those particular companies away from funding this project because of the reputational damage that these activists and these protesters were creating. So that's my quick shout out. Slightly biased based on my background in social movements, but I think there are lots of forces, as everyone's reiterated, there are lots of forces pushing for change. Law is just one of them, and there are a lot of amazing people using the different skills around this country and around the world as well. And just quick shout out to all the work that they're doing.
Great, thanks to all of you for your really fantastic and inspiring answers. So I'll just hand over now to Emer just to conclude. So.
Great, thanks Helena, and thanks to everyone for your contributions there. I would just like to echo what Bree said, because I think almost like case in point, my initial contact with EDO was through the Stop Adani movement, which has, now it's allowing us to have this space here, and I think it's just really, it just highlights the importance of collaborating and having that international collaboration, and how kind of one thing can lead to the next, and for progress. So I think that just came to mind as highlighting what you were saying, and just also to echo the like congratulations to all the activists who have been working on these issues over the years and the fantastic work they're doing. And in that vein, also to thank you all for your work at EDO, ClientEarth, and Environmental Rights Action in Nigeria. Just fantastic contributions. And as we were emphasizing the importance of, countries taking inspiration from each other, your work is applicable outside of, on a higher level as well. So thank you for that. So yeah, I suppose we're ready to wrap up now. Just to thank you all. I'm really grateful for all of your contributions. It's been I think I speak for everyone in attendance when I say it's been very inspiring and thought-provoking. I hope everyone, I certainly do, I hope everyone else feels kind of riled up to continue this work and fight the good fight and hold the polluters to account. So yeah, just would, on behalf of Climate Case Ireland, would really like to express our gratitude to Paul, Sean, Bree and Chima for taking part, and to apologise again for the technical issues at the start, and we're grateful that you all have stayed on board and nobody was rushing off. I'm also very aware that it's nearly 10 o'clock at night in Australia, so really grateful for that, and I know you all have very busy schedules, so thanks for taking the time. So really appreciate all of you joining today. Thanks. And thanks to Helena, Matthew and Clodagh for helping to moderate. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Elena.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. Bye.